Now, this is one I'd really like to talk about that does a very much good job on assessing collections and is colloquially known as weeding, weeding a collection. It's a deselection process, removing items from a library, colloquially referred to as weeding the collection. This is, I'm going to provide some information about weeding. And we'll get started, but mind you, weeding is a little different between libraries. Public libraries weed quite heavily. Academic libraries weed a little less, but they still weed, but they weed in a different fashion because they're not looking for users in the same sense as academic library or as public libraries do, where they're looking for the community changes more frequently. Or should we say that interests change more frequently in public libraries. Whereas in an academic library, you tend to have one person that's teaching for years on a particular topic. So let's get started and we'll talk a little bit about weeding. And as we get to it, we'll talk about sources that you can use. Well, let's talk about weeding. Why do you weed? You weed to get rid of materials that are not useful to the collection. Public library weeds because of a variety of factors, like the book doesn't look good anymore, for example, or it's trivial. Now, we'll cover these a little bit more in detail. Academic libraries weed because they're trying to get room to be able to add things for the faculty to actually use. But the faculty tend, you might have an academic library, you might have multiple editions of the same book, or you might have multiple copies, but you probably want a current edition, and you may or may not need multiple copies. It depends. You might buy them to start with and then weed out the ones that you don't need after that point. So the more important question is, you weed to get the collection that's usable by the user. Whether it is a public library, school library, where you're trying to get current editions or something, there is a very good process on how to weed. And the one that I really encourage you to look at and use is what's referred to as the CREW report from the University or from the Texas State Library. The CREW report stands for Continuous Review, Evaluation, and Weeding. In other words, that as you read the CREW review report, it's going to tell you that you're not weeding once every so often. That weeding needs to be all part and parcel of review and evaluation. In other words, assessing a collection, evaluating a collection, and weeding a collection. It's kind of a multi-step thing where you're doing something at some point all the time. And the term that's used in the CREW report is an acronym called MUSTY. Now, MUSTY actually stands for misleading, ugly, superseded, trivial, or irrelevant, or elsewhere. In other words, is the book misleading? Is the book ugly and old? Is it, in other words, is the topic misleading? Has it got information that is no longer accurate? A medical textbook that tells you to use leeches, for example, something silly like that. But you understand what I'm trying to say is it's misleading. It has misleading information in the book. The book is ugly. Public library, a book that does not look well does not circulate. You may have an edition of a novel that the newer edition might even have a picture of the movie, let's say. Well, the older one might just be tattered and been used and just doesn't look good on the shelf. And it is known that people in public libraries will pick a newer copy of the same edition of a book than they will pick an older, more heavily used copy. The other question is superseded. Has the material in the information been superseded by a new edition, let's say? Is the information trivial? Is there something in the book that is of a trivial interest? Is the book irrelevant? Not usable at all. It's just totally irrelevant to the collection. And is it available elsewhere? In other words, you might be looking at an item that you say, I don't need it that frequently, but I can borrow it from another library. And I can get it fairly easily. So why do I need to keep a copy that's going to be used every couple of years when I can get it at this other location? So those are the areas. If you remember the word musty and you look at a crew report, you'll get a lot of detail, but this is the basis of the acronym. Now, the crew report is arranged by Dewey arrangement. And it has various sections in there, like they'll say audio cassettes are no longer used. People don't use audio cassettes, they use CDs. So you should get rid of all your audio cassettes, for example. In other words, as technology changes, VHS tapes, different things, you would get rid of those. Actually, I meant to write tapes and I wrote tap, but I can change that easily enough later. But those are the things that you would get rid of. Now, let's talk about the crew steps. Again, as you read the crew, you'll get more of this information, each one of these sections. But weeding should be part of the policy. It should be in your collection development policy. It should be part of the, usually is part of the policy is part of the collection development policy. Weeding should be somehow incorporated. You should never make weeding sporadic. It should be a part of a policy. It should be built into the year's calendar. The only time that somebody has really gotten in trouble with weeding, and it has occurred, I'll send some of this in the discussion, but it has occurred, and it's always been because somebody has not made weeding as part of the policy, as part of the, let people know that you're weeding and why you're weeding. It's when you hide weeding that it gets into problems. Always make weeding a open activity. Gather usage studies for the library. Usage studies can be how people use the collection, anything that you have that gives you this kind of information. This is part of the computer printouts of the section reviewed. What they recommend is that you gather materials onto a book truck, and on the book truck you have the computer printouts of the section that is being reviewed. In other words, what is the use of the collection? Does it circulate heavily? Does it not circulate? Get a computer printout that shows you the section being used. Frequently what they'll do is they'll do a computer printout that may be like X number of years old, like 5 years old. Let's just say things that checked out in the last 5 years. In other words, your printout may be everything, or it might be just something that says these are specifically the things that have checked out in a certain period of time. I say 5 years, but it depends on the library, depends on what you want to research. Put notes and sticky notes on the cart, colored pens, shelf markers, a copy of the crew manual, physical copy of the crew manual, and any disposal slips used by the library. The crew manual has an example of a possible disposal slip if your library doesn't have one that you could, in theory, create. But these things are useful for marking the books, for marking the printouts, to start the process of weeding. Now, of course, you've made weeding as part of an annual event. And you might, if you're responsible for multiple areas, you might weed one area on 1 month and then 3 months later do another area. It doesn't mean that you have to do weeding all for the whole library at one time, but build weeding into your calendar so that you do it annually. You look at the collection, you assess the collection, and you weed it on an annual basis. Now, the first thing you should do, you should look at the entire collection itself to be weeded as a whole collection. In other words, look at the whole area first and weed a whole area, or examine a whole area, assess a collection of a whole area. Do an inventory at the same time. Look for materials on the shelf that say they're checked out. Look for the things that are not there that should be there, that are missing. They're either missing on the shelf there and somewhere else in the collection. That would be picked up as part of the shelf reading process that a library should do as part, You should always, when you have a shelver or a page or somebody that does shelving, they should, as part of their process, in addition to shelving collections, is they should shelf read a collection. When I used to have students that shelf read for the library, I would sit there and I would say, you have to shelf read, you have to shelve all the books that are outstanding that need to be shelved. But then every week you're expected to shelf read a very specific area of the collection. Now with publications, I had an area that was heavy in journals, magazines, journals, in my case journals, and I would have them read like maybe 4 shelf ranges, because they can be read very quickly because there's dates on the books. This was back when we had books before it was electronic. But when it came to the books, I might only have them read a single shelf, because shelf reading a collection as a rule is a very time-consuming thing. That has changed a little bit in that there have been programs written that can scan like RFIDs in books, and you can just run it across the collection very quickly and shelf read very rapidly using an RFID program. Again, check any books against any standard lists and books that may need repair. In the back of the crew manual, there are a number of links to standard lists. When we talked about core lists and different things, the crew manual actually has, the crew manual is updated frequently and has lists in the back of the crew manual that allow you to link to the various core lists. You can take a look at any books that might need replacing and not weeding. You might see a book that is ugly, for example, and you're going to have to replace it, but it's of a nature that does not need weeding, but needs replacing. So you can see how this whole process of the crew is not just weeding, it is also examining how to assess a collection. Look at the book, determine if it's got low use, but high quality. It might be a really good book that is not circulating heavily, so you need to display it. If you display it, it might circulate. It's known that books on display tend to circulate a lot more than books on the shelf. So you may have an area. We had an area one time with displays where we took a field of study, like maybe it was Martin Luther King Day, and we would put all the books of that topic, not just Martin Luther King, but other books that fit that category, and we'd put those out for display. There are the banned book weeks where we might put banned books out, books that have been banned at some point in history on the shelf. You might sit there and just simply say, okay, there's a really good collection that has low use, but looks like a really good collection, and rather than weed it, we'll display it for a while and see if it kicks up the circulation. Now, electronic copies. I know a lot of you are interested in electronic copies, and electronic copies is a whole new field in weeding, in that most libraries have electronic copies that are part of a part of a collection like Overdrive or Hoopla. So you got to consider those. You might not have control over something like Hoopla, really, or Overdrive, but there are some publications the library owns. So you have to look at those things first. Now, electronic books are different because they cannot really be ugly. An electronic copy is not going to get, by use, is not going to get damaged in any way. But they can be misleading, they can be trivial, and they can have copy dates with newer editions and irrelevant to the patron. So you may want to weed electronic books, especially like, say, a self-published electronic book which is not really used. You might delete it off the system or move it to storage. What if it's a copyright date? Make sure that you have the newest edition in the electronic database. You might want to get rid of the older edition and add the newer edition electronically, so that people are not dissuaded by an edition that may have changed. There's one series of book. There's a book that I've got in paper copy that is in the 3rd edition, book on public libraries, that the newest edition is so totally different than the older editions. I like the older editions, so I'm not going to argue with that, but the new edition, the current edition, is so much more different. Chapters are completely different. The way they're written are completely different. So that it is a case where the newest edition is completely different than the older edition. And electronically, you might want to get rid of an older edition in favor of a newer edition. They can be trivial and misleading. Let's just say an older medical publication which no longer has current information, you might want to remove them from the database. There are electronic copies of journals that the publisher has actually removed. In the print version, it was always part of the library system, and then later the publication was put in like a little page that would say, please ignore this previous article. Nowadays, electronically, they just remove the article. And then, of course, it's not used. You might have a process where you say, okay, it's never been used, so let's just not have it online. So electronic copies are a little different because they're not the same storage issues that you have with something on the shelf, but they can still be misleading. They can still be trivial. You can still have newer editions. And you can do this if the library owns it and it's not part of an overall system like Hoopla. If it's part of an overall system like Hoopla, then you have to actually talk to the company that owns it, and you can't do anything more than let them know about the information being changed or something. But you can't effectively change it yourself. Now, there is another one that is specifically for media called Wurst. Any CD-ROM, any electronic media, video, DVD, Blu-ray, etc., can have Wurst. It can be worn out. It can be out of date. Effectively, something so old that you're not going to, doesn't ever circulate. Could be rarely used. You had it, but no one ever seems to care to use it. Again, like anything else, it can be applied elsewhere, and you can also consider trivial. Now, Musty also has a section in the manual that deals specifically with media. So Musty works for media as well. Wurst is specifically for media. Musty is for books and any printed material, but also has sections on media. Now, the thing about Musty is it's going to be by Dewey number. You could use it for other fields as well, but it works specifically for media. or excuse me, Musty works for media as well. The other thing that you need to realize is that in academia, one of the old rules was use RLG, Research Libraries Group. No longer truly exists as an organization. It ceased several years ago, Research Libraries Group, but the levels for a collection, which are based on RLG numbers, still operate. They're still used, and they tend to be specifically for universities. RLG will do things like, so it's got like levels like 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B. In other words, you have everything, like 3 is education. You'll have everything on education, or you'll have some things on education. 2 is a level of research, and 1 is like the top level of research. Like 1A means you collect everything there is on the topic, whereas 1B means you collect some things but not everything. You collect the newest stuff, you don't collect the oldest stuff. With the RLG, it tends to be universities, and it tends to have information that is, you might have one single collection area like English, and a specific area of American Lit you collect everything on, another area of American Lit you don't. And that's the level at which it does the work. The difference is, whereas Musty is based on Dewey number, RLG is based on Library of Congress numbers. Now, again, any questions, you can send to me by virtual office, email, we can have discussions. I will try to post some of the links in the discussion area so that you have quick access to the information rather than have to follow the document. Mostly it's a link to the crew report. And if you take an opportunity, take a look at the crew report and see how things are pulled together. It gives you very detailed information about how to use it. It takes Dewey numbers and says that this area of the Dewey number, this area of the Dewey number. You might collect everything, it has very good recommendations. So, thank you. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.